The most magnetic personal brands aren't about performance, they're about resonance. They're about inspiring trust and confidence. We can sometimes think of rapport as something that we either have or don't have with someone. But what if it could actually be cultivated? Today I want to talk about the subtle art of rapport, and I want to share my 5 tips to quietly build your personal brand presence. Grab your cup of tea and let's dive into it. Number 1 is the swiveling spotlight. This was an idea that really stood out to me when I read the book How to Talk to Anyone by Lounds. The idea of the swiveling spotlight is to imagine that when you are in a conversation with someone else, that there is a spotlight above you. And when you speak, the spotlight is on you. Whereas when the other person speaks, the spotlight is on them. And the idea is to, as much as possible, keep that spotlight on the other person. Allow them to talk about themselves, to share whatever it is that they want to discuss. By doing that, you automatically become more magnetic because people like people who are interested in them. They don't necessarily like people who just want to talk about themselves or talk about all their thoughts, their feelings, their achievements. They want to be able to interact with people who also notice them. So instead of taking the approach of constantly having that spotlight on you, constantly talking about yourself in a way that potentially dims another person's light, consider how you can swivel that spotlight around and put the light on the other person to make them feel like they are seen in that conversation. Number 2 is to skip cliche or worse, crass questions. This was another thing that really stood out to me when I read the book How to Talk to Anyone, because Lowndes points out something that I think is perhaps not discussed in at least any other book that I have read, and it is this idea of the question that you always hear every time you meet a new person, whether it is professionally or personally. You hear it at every event that you go to. It will eventually come up. It is the question, what do you do? And Lowndes describes in the book how the big winners, as she calls them in the book, don't ask what could be considered a classless question. Because the thing about this question, even if it is well intended, even if it is just a really natural cliche in most conversations, is that it can actually be a really insensitive question. Because while you think that it is a question that you ask most people that you meet, you may not be considering the circumstances that that person that you are asking that question to is in. For example, maybe that person has recently lost their job and they don't want to necessarily be talking about work. Maybe they are someone who generally just doesn't want to talk about work. Maybe they have a role that is not generally understood and they don't really feel like explaining that to other people. Or maybe they have a role that they don't necessarily want to talk about for privacy reasons. Maybe they also have a role that is potentially a high-powered role that they don't necessarily want to draw attention to. And Lowndes also highlights something that was really interesting to me, which didn't actually occur to me prior, was that maybe they don't actually work at all because they have already made enough money to not have to work. And then that becomes a difficult question to be able to answer. Or maybe they are someone who is looking after their family full-time. They are a full-time parent or a full-time carer maybe in whatever their family dynamic is. So by asking a question like that, you are potentially diminishing the way that they spend their time, or you are putting them in a potentially uncomfortable situation as well. So instead of asking a question like that, consider a more human-centered approach to the conversation. And if you do want to maybe open up the opportunity to discuss something in that realm, maybe you will ask something instead like, how do you spend your time? And then that leaves it open to the other person to discuss whatever it is that that they want to discuss. If they want to tell you about their work, then they will. So instead of asking surface level questions that could be unintentionally insensitive, take this human-centered approach to conversations. Add warmth and depth to your conversations for values-driven as opposed to resume-centered conversations. Number 3 is a link with language. This was something that I learned about more in neurolinguistics programming, NLP, where NLP highlights that we all have this representation system that we communicate through. We have a primary representation system, a preferred modality, and that might be through each of the 5 senses. For example, you might be someone who is more visual or more auditory based, more feelings based. Maybe you communicate the most through smell or through feel, for example. And when you tap into another person's modality, their preferred modality, then it just gives you this extra opportunity to be able to communicate. And you might do that by listening to the language that they are using. This can give you clues into their preferred modality. For example, they might say, sounds good, or looks good, or feels right. So if you start to pay attention to those keywords that give away what their modality is, it gives you a chance to connect through that. So instead of just communicating through your preferred modality, consider if you can tap into the other person's preferred modality. So you can meet them where they are and communicate a language that they most resonate with. Number 4 is tune in to tone, not just words. The communication pie tells us that 38% of communication is tone and just 7% of communication relates to the words itself. So consider the tone that you bring to a conversation. Now, I'm not just talking about the tone of your language overall, I'm talking about matching the tone of the other person, the energy that they are bringing to the conversation. What is the tempo of their communication? What's the tone? What's the timing of how they are communicating? And without mimicking them, consider if you can match that same energy in a subtle way. So instead of coming to a conversation, for example, completely stiff and upright, if that other person is more laid back and casual, then try and match the vibe of the conversation. So go from communicating in a way that is potentially out of sync from the person that you are trying to connect with. Maybe you are too formal, too flat, too fast in the way that you are communicating, and transform your energy into an energy that matches that other person. Number 5 is mirror body movement. Now, I know that the generic advice is usually to communicate through your body language, but mirroring body movement just takes that to another level. This is about matching the body movements of the person that you are connecting with. Again, this isn't about mimicking them, it is just about tapping into that energy. Because when you do that, this activates the mirror neurons in their brain. For example, when someone leans in, when they smile, when they gesture, when we are exposed to that, the mirror neurons in our own mind activate as though we are leaning in, smiling, and gesturing. And it's just a really subtle way to be able to create that connection with another person. It's the subtle foundation of how we empathize and build bonds and trust between each other. So instead of just holding a posture that is oblivious to the other person's physical movements, consider if you can match their energy in terms of their body movements and bring warmth and presence to the conversation without even having to say a word. Thanks so much. Subscribe for more on personal branding, and I'll see you in the next episode.